Right now, if you break the law, you might pay a fine. You might sit in a room for a few years. You might get a stern warning and walk free. It feels almost civilized. But for most of human history, justice did not look like this at all. It looked like something out of a nightmare. And the strangest part is this: these were not myths. These were not exaggerations passed down by frightened storytellers. These were real, documented, government-approved methods of punishment carried out in broad daylight in front of crowds who came to watch. Some of them lasted for days. Some of them were designed to keep the victim alive for as long as possible, so the suffering could stretch on and on. Why? Because ancient societies did not just want to punish a criminal. They wanted to send a message so terrifying that no one else would dare think about breaking the law. Let's go back, far back, to a time when mercy was rare and pain was public entertainment. Start in ancient Mesopotamia, around 1750 BC, under the rule of King Hammurabi. You have probably heard the phrase, an eye for an eye. That phrase came from his law code, carved into a massive stone pillar for everyone to see. But it was not just a saying, it was a literal instruction. If you took someone's eye, your eye was taken. If you broke someone's bone, your bone was broken. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son was put to death in return. Read that again. The punishment did not always land on the criminal. Sometimes it landed on their family. Justice in this world was not about fairness. It was about balance, even if that balance meant an innocent person paid the price. Move forward to ancient Egypt, where certain crimes against the state were treated as crimes against the gods themselves. Tomb robbers, when caught, faced impalement. A sharpened wooden stake was driven through the body, and the criminal was left on display sometimes for days as the life slowly drained out of them. It was not just about killing. It was about making sure everyone in the city walked past that stake and understood exactly what waited for them if they were caught. Fear was the currency. And it worked. Ancient Egyptian court records show that confessions were often extracted before punishment, using beatings so severe that people admitted to crimes they never committed, just to make the pain stop sooner. Now travel to ancient Rome, a civilization famous for law, order, and engineering, but Rome also perfected one of the most agonizing execution methods in human history: crucifixion. You already know the word, but do you know what it actually did to the body? The condemned were nailed or tied to a wooden cross, arms stretched wide, feet pinned below. Death did not come quickly. It came slowly, from exhaustion and suffocation, as the body's own weight made it harder and harder to breathe. Some victims lasted for days, hanging in the sun, unable to move, unable to escape, watched by anyone who passed by. Rome used this punishment specifically for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. Why? Because it was slow. Because it was visible. Because it was humiliating. A quick death sends no message. A slow one, in public, sends a very clear one. But if you think Rome was the peak of cruelty, wait until you hear what happened in ancient China. One of the most feared punishments in Chinese imperial history was called Lingchi, sometimes translated as death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for the most serious crimes like treason or the murder of a parent, the punishment involved slowly removing small pieces of the body over an extended period of time, keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. It was not designed for a fast execution, it was designed as the opposite. The goal was prolonged suffering, carried out publicly, so the crowd understood the full weight of the crime being punished. This practice continued in some form for centuries, and was not formally abolished in China until 1905, just over 100 years ago. Think about that timeline for a second. This was not some distant, foggy legend from the beginning of civilization. This was recent enough that your great-great-grandparents were alive while it was still happening somewhere on Earth. Now let's cross the ocean to the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico, before Spanish colonization in the 1500s. The Aztecs had strict laws, and breaking them carried severe consequences. Adultery, in some cases, was punished by death. Drunkenness among nobles could result in execution, while ordinary citizens might receive a lesser punishment, because the Aztecs believed leaders had to be held to a higher standard, not a lower one. And then there was the most infamous Aztec practice of all: human sacrifice, often tied to religious ceremony rather than crime, where victims were led to the top of a temple and had their hearts removed while still alive, offered to the gods in the belief that this act kept the sun moving across the sky. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these ceremonies described the sheer scale of it, with some historical estimates suggesting thousands of individuals sacrificed during major festivals. Was it punishment? Not exactly, but it shows you something important. In many ancient societies, the line between crime, religion, and public death was barely a line at all. Let's go to medieval Europe now, a period stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century AD. This era gave us the breaking wheel, a large wooden wheel used to slowly shatter every major bone in a person's body, one at a time, while the crowd watched. The condemned was tied to the wheel, and the executioner methodically broke the arms, legs, and sometimes the spine, before finally ending the ordeal, if mercy was granted at all. Some victims were left on the wheel to die slowly from their injuries and exposure, sometimes taking days. This punishment was used across France, Germany, and other parts of Europe well into the 1700s. Not ancient Rome, not distant Mesopotamia. This was happening in Europe at roughly the same time people were writing symphonies and designing early scientific instruments. Civilization and brutality, it turns out, have always lived side by side. Now consider Sparta, the ancient Greek city-state famous for producing some of history's most feared warriors. Spartan justice was not about courtrooms. It was about survival itself. Young Spartan boys accused of weakness, cowardice, or failure during training could be beaten publicly, sometimes to the point of death, and the community was expected to watch without flinching. There was even a secret institution called the Crypteia, where select young Spartan men were sent out into the countryside with permission to kill enslaved helots, the labor class of Spartan society, seemingly without formal trial, as a method of enforcing fear and control. Historical sources describe this less as isolated punishment and more as an ongoing system of terror, embedded into how the entire society functioned. Ask yourself this: what kind of world requires fear that deep just to keep order? And then there is ancient Persia, under rulers like the Achaemenid kings, where a punishment known as scaphism was described by ancient Greek writers. The condemned was placed inside a hollowed structure, often built from two joined boats, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed, then force-fed milk and honey until severe illness set in, while honey was also smeared across the exposed skin to attract insects. The person was left like this for an extended period, sometimes reported to last many days, with death coming slowly from exposure or infection rather than a single decisive blow. Historians still debate exactly how widely this punishment was actually used versus how much was exaggerated by later writers, but the fact that it was described in detail at all tells you something about the era. Cruelty was not hidden. It was recorded almost proudly as proof of a ruler's absolute power. Let's move to ancient Assyria, one of the most feared empires of the ancient Near East, thriving from roughly 900 to 600 BC. Assyrian kings left behind stone carvings that documented their punishments in astonishing detail, almost as propaganda. Flaying, the removal of skin from the body, was recorded as a punishment for rebellious governors and conquered kings who dared to resist Assyrian rule. Sometimes the skin was displayed on city walls, a warning to any future rebels passing through the gates. This was not hidden shame. It was carved into palace walls for visitors to see. Why record something so horrifying in permanent stone? Because the fear itself was the point. An empire that size could not police every corner of its territory. So instead, it made sure everyone remembered exactly what defiance would cost. Now think about ancient Japan, particularly during the feudal era stretching from roughly the 12th to the 19th century AD. Samurai society operated under a strict code, and one of its most severe punishments was crucifixion, adapted specifically for certain crimes such as arson, which was treated as an especially serious offense because entire wooden cities could burn to the ground from a single fire. The condemned was bound to a wooden frame and then, in many documented cases, executed slowly with spears, deliberately avoiding vital organs at first so the suffering could be prolonged in front of onlookers. Japanese legal records from this period describe punishment tiers based on the severity of the crime, with the most feared reserved for those seen as threatening the stability of the entire community, not just an individual victim. Consider the Viking Age in Scandinavia, roughly 800 to 1050 AD, a period often romanticized in modern films and shows. But Norse law, recorded in later texts like the Icelandic sagas, describes a punishment called the blood eagle, reportedly used on the most hated enemies, particularly rival kings or betrayers. Ribs were said to be cut away from the spine and spread outward, and the lungs pulled through the opening, arranged to resemble a spread eagle's wings. Historians still argue fiercely about how literally this was ever carried out versus how much was poetic exaggeration written centuries after the events described. But even as a documented legend within Norse culture itself, the fact that such a punishment was imaginable and spoken of with something close to pride tells you how far societies were willing to go to make an example of betrayal. Now consider the Inca Empire, ruling across the Andes Mountains from the 1400s until Spanish conquest in the 1530s. Inca law divided crimes into offenses against individuals and offenses against the state, and the state took priority above almost everything else. Treason against the Sapa Inca, the emperor believed to be descended from the sun god, was punished by methods designed to strip away dignity entirely, including public stoning or being thrown from cliffs in front of the community. Theft from state storehouses, which held food reserves meant to protect the entire empire during famine, could carry the death penalty, because in a society built on collective survival, stealing from the group was treated as an attack on everyone at once, not just a crime against property. And in ancient India, under the Mauryan Empire around the 3rd century BC, the statesman Kautilya documented an extensive legal and punishment system in a text known as the Artha Shastra. It described specific penalties matched to specific crimes with almost bureaucratic precision, including mutilation for certain thefts and execution methods reserved for crimes against the king himself. What makes this document remarkable is how calmly it lays everything out, almost like a manual, listing punishment after punishment the way a modern document might list tax brackets. There was no confusion, no ambiguity, no room for mercy built into the language at all. The punishment simply matched the crime, and everyone was expected to understand exactly where they stood. Now, zoom back out. Why did so many ancient civilizations across completely different continents and completely different centuries arrive at such similar conclusions? Slow punishment, public display, maximum visibility. It was never really about the individual criminal. It was about every single person watching. A fast private death teaches no lesson. A slow public one becomes a story, retold for years, whispered to children as a warning. In a world without newspapers, without broadcast news, without social media, public punishment was the message itself. It traveled from person to person, city to city, simply through fear and memory. And here is the part that should really unsettle you. Some of these methods were still legally used within the last 200 to 300 years. Not ancient history, recent history. The breaking wheel was used in parts of Europe into the 1700s. Lingchi was used in China until 1905. Public executions in various brutal forms continued in parts of the world well into the 20th century. The gap between ancient brutality and modern civilization is far smaller than most people assume. Does that unsettle you a little? Think about how quickly all of this could return under the wrong conditions. Laws are not permanent. They are choices made by whoever holds power at whatever moment they hold it. The people who lived through the punishments you just heard did not think of themselves as living in a dark age. They thought their world made perfect sense. They believed their punishments were justice, plain and simple. What does that tell you about the world you're living in right now? Notice something else, too. Almost none of these societies saw themselves as cruel for cruelty's sake. Hammurabi believed he was creating balance. Assyrian kings believed they were preserving order across an empire too vast to control any other way. Inca officials believed they were protecting a fragile system that kept entire populations from starving during drought years. Every single one of them had a story that made the suffering make sense, at least to the people enforcing it. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty. It usually arrives wearing the mask of necessity or tradition or justice, and the people carrying it out often walked away feeling like they had done exactly the right thing. So the next time you think about how far humanity has come, remember this. For most of our history, justice was not about correction. It was not about rehabilitation. It was about spectacle, fear, and control carried out on real people in real places at real moments in time that historians have documented in detail. Right now, if you break the law, you might pay a fine. But for almost all of human history, that fine would have been the mercy. And mercy back then was almost never on the table.